But I'd like to invite Marko Saarinen from the Embassy of Finland to make a few welcoming remarks. Thank you, Marko.
Good morning to all. So I'm Marko Saarinen. I'm a counselor for development cooperation at the Finnish Embassy. And I'm happy to be here with you this morning to discuss circular economy transition and bringing in some Finnish or European perspectives to this topic. I would like to start by saying that we are very ambitious about circular economy in Finland, and it's an integral part of our climate and innovation policies, and increasingly so also on our foreign policy, trade policy, and development policy. In terms of climate targets, we probably have one of the most ambitious targets in the world. We aim to become a carbon neutral circular economy by 2035. And we have started the circular economy policy work quite early. We were the first country in the world to put together a national roadmap to transition to circular economy in 2016. And it's now in its second version since 2019, going until 2025. And that basically the roadmap brings together all different types of stakeholders and puts together common vision on the transition and the main steps that need to be taken, as well as bringing in the commitments already made. As well as highlighting parts that are critical for the transition that don't yet have ownership. Our innovation fund, Sitra, is the one that led the process in Finland. It was, as I mentioned, very consultative process, and they have actually put together also a guide on the Finnish experience on a circular economy roadmap development, which we hope that can be helpful to other countries in terms of planning the process. Of course, it's never the same in different countries, but maybe that guide can provide some learnings on the process as it was in Finland. We have other related roadmaps as well. We're now in our second edition since June this year of our plastic roadmap, and there's a target of to ensure the breakthrough to circular plastic economy by 2030. And in connection to our climate target, we have I think it's 13 sectoral industry roadmaps for low carbon development to reach the 2035 carbon neutral circular economy target. And basically those roadmaps show that this ambitious target is possible with existing technology as well as technology in the pipeline. But a lot of investments are required, and emphasis on the enabling environment is quite strong. And circular economy is seen as one of the keys to achieving these low carbon industry roadmaps. We have since 21 also a strategic program to promote circular economy. This comes partly from the European Commission's Circular Economy Action Plan from 2020, and the role of circular economy in achieving the objectives of the European Green Deal for climate neutral, resource efficient and sustainable Europe. Yes, so this program it sets the objectives and defines the necessary measures and allocates the resources that are needed to promote the transition. And the aim is to transform the economy into one that is based on principles of circular economy by 2035, as mentioned earlier. Moving to foreign policy, we are very active in our EU family, and we also see circular economy as a comprehensive part of our climate and innovation policy, as mentioned, and it can reinforce the role that Finland has in implementation of sustainable development goals in the international context. We see it also as early adopters of circular economy, bringing in some trade opportunities for Finnish and European circular economy solutions. I know the World Circular Economy Forum has been discussed here yesterday, and that's actually also an extension of our foreign policy. It is, of course, an international collaboration, but it was started in Finland, and the Finnish Innovation Fund, Sitra, co-convenes the event annually. And the aim is to advance a global transition into circular economy and to a fair and competitive carbon neutral circular economy, to be precise. And we're very happy to see the World Circular Economy Forum organized in Africa for the first time this year in Kigali next month. And we are, in addition to the work that Sitra does, we're also supporting this as a strategic partner of the Africa Circular Economy Alliance. Finland became a strategic partner in end of 2019, and the European Commission is also a strategic partner since earlier this year. And we also launched with the African Development Bank and the Nordic Development Fund a new facility to support the work of the Africa Circular Economy Alliance. This was launched a few months ago, and will provide funding to the work program of ASEA, as well as well, this year we're also financing part of the World Circular Economy Forum organization, and we're looking to launch call for proposals for support to countries in Africa who want to embark on a circular economy roadmap development process. And from next year, there will also be support available for private sector transition processes in Africa. I would also like to mention that we have, in addition to this type of exchanges, that we're happy to participate in the context of South African policy and those that are organized within the strategic partnership between the EU and South Africa. We're also providing funding for accelerating the growth of innovative South African circular economy companies. And at the moment, we have 3 very good partners in this work. We're working with Fetola, WOMHub, and ICLEI Africa. So we decided to focus on intermediary organizations, that like innovation support organizations, and we're reaching a bigger number of companies through this type of collaborations together with the other partners of these organizations. And the first 3 projects are coming to close at the end of this year. We're still expecting the final results of the projects, but it looks very promising. It seems clear that circularity in the business models of the companies has increased, and there are indications of around 200 new jobs having been created, and also that the income of the participating companies has increased. And we're at the moment in process of selecting the new projects to support for the coming 2 years. I think I will close there. That probably I've exceeded my time already, but oh yes, there was one speaker who couldn't make it. So, but yeah, happy to continue the discussion today and after, and I hope that many of you have the opportunity also to participate the World Circular Economy Forum, either in Kigali or online, or in the studio in Cape Town that the ACEN is organizing at the same time. Okay, thank you very much.
Good morning, everyone. I'm Katerina Giering. I'm from the African Circular Economy Network. I'm standing in now for one of the departments that couldn't make it, and I'm very honored to chair this session. And obviously, I'm handing over in a second to Linda, actually, about briefing notes that the CSIR has written and that I devoured when they came out. They're very exciting. They speak to the main sectors that really need to shift to a circular economy in Africa, and I think it's quite an exciting topic. They already look at the initiatives that happen and how we actually can interlink those. So without further ado, I will give it over to Linda again and hope to have some nice questions later on as well.
Thank you, Katerina. And also a big thank you to the African Circular Economy Network, who's been a thought partner with us on these 2 days, and for sharing and inviting so many of the network into probably many who are joining us virtually today. So with that, let me jump right in to the presentation. Apologies to those colleagues in South Africa who might have already heard this news before, but hopefully we've got many joining from across the continent and beyond that haven't. So I'd like to present this morning on work that the CSR recently completed around understanding what the circular economy means for South Africa. So first of all, I always like to start off my presentation with this slide. There's very often this confusion that the circular economy is about waste management, probably even worse, that the circular economy is a synonym for recycling. And I always like to say the circular economy is not about waste. It's about sustainable resource management. Yes, it aims to decouple development and decouple growth from resource consumption. But I would actually argue from South Africa's perspective that it's actually about national resource security. It asks this question: how do we as South Africa use our resources? And are we using our resources in the best interest of our people and in the best interests of our own development? Now, what's interesting is that over the last decade or so, we've seen a number of drivers that have been moving the circular economy agenda along. It started largely with this issue around resource scarcity. If I think back to the early work that the EU had done around the critical raw materials, I think back then there were about 10, 14, if I remember correctly, critical raw materials. And other countries have done similar work. I think Japan has done, the US has done. What are resources that a country needs to achieve their socio-economic development objectives, which they may or may not have in the ground? And if they don't have them, obviously there's a risk to development. So what plans do you need to put in place to ensure that you can secure access to those resources? That has shifted, and we've seen climate mitigation come onto the table as a driver to transition to a circular economy. The International Resources Panel published this work that said 50% of climate impacts, 90% of water stress, 90% of biodiversity loss comes from the extraction and processing of resources. And so if we can change the way we use, consume, manage our resources, we have the opportunity to address these big global challenges. With the pandemic that hit us, we then started to see the drivers shift towards, this is an opportunity for economic recovery. The Build Back Better, the green economic recovery agenda started to push the circular economy transition. And I think for us as South Africa, there's probably a fourth driver, and I would almost argue a more important one, in terms of saying that the circular economy provides us with an opportunity for socio-economic development. We are faced with a crisis around unemployment. We have jobless growth in the country. We have high levels of poverty, unemployment, and does the circular economy provide us with an opportunity to address these social challenges? So where is South Africa in terms of our circular economy transition? The Department of Science and Innovation funded the study that was done by the University of Cape Town and Boku in Austria to map the level of circularity of the South African economy. And what it shows us, as we, I think, largely suspected, is that we have a very extractive-based economy. A large amount of that is exported into the global market. We have these large throughputs of waste within the economy and a very tiny level of circularity, estimated to be only 7% circular, and a lot of that is actually due to ecological cycling, so in terms of biomass, organic streams, etc. What's very interesting, one of the key interesting points that came out of the study was the very low level of stock building for South Africa. So very little of our resources for South Africa actually goes into local stock building. And in fact, when you compare that to the rest of the world, you can see that the stock added per capita for South Africa, while we are slightly ahead of the rest of sub-Saharan Africa, it's very low by global standards. So again, reflecting on that question, are we as a country using our resources to actually build our infrastructure, dams, roads, rails, houses, to address the key issues and challenges that are facing our economy? So the very first question that we as South Africa wanted to ask, just reflecting on those big global drivers, is resource scarcity a reason for South Africa to transition to a more circular economy? And immediately when I sort of reflected on that question, I thought, no, well, it can't be. I mean, we're a mineral-rich country. We've got a long history of mining. It makes up around 8% of our GDP. So surely that can't be. We must have hundreds of years of resources still left in the ground. Well, it turns out, yes, resource scarcity may in fact be a driver for South Africa to transition to a more circular economy. Our CSIR mining team identified 18 critical or strategic minerals for South Africa that were important in terms of economic development or in terms of supply risk. 5 of those had less than 50 years of economically viable mining remaining. Those 5 included iron ore, lead, manganese that had less than 20 years, which is still hopefully within my lifetime, and cobalt, gold, had between 20 to 50 years of economically viable mining remaining. And the tragic part is that those 5 that have less than 50 years, the majority of those resources, I think it was in excess of 90%, is actually exported out of South Africa, which leaves us very little control in terms of implementing circularity and bringing those resources at end of life back into the South African economy. But yes, the circular economy does also provide opportunities for the mining sector as well as risks. So as we transition to alternative technologies, as we transition to renewable energy, electric vehicles, for example, there's a greater demand for things like rare earth elements, other minerals. And so while it creates an opportunity for our mining sector to expand, to extract, to provide those resources into the economy, hopefully also to grow local beneficiation and value add of those resources in South Africa, it does again also create a risk for the sector. So then we looked at the other opportunities for the South African economy. And the questions we asked ourselves is, which sectors are strategic for South Africa's development, first and foremost? Secondly, which sectors have the greatest resource demands in terms of energy, water, materials? And which sectors or regions are facing resource insecurity? We know that some of our provinces, for example, if you think about the terrible drought we had in the Western Cape, the ongoing drought we still have in the Eastern Cape, where access to water resources is a constraint to development. And so these were the 7 different sectors that we identified for the study: mining, agriculture, manufacturing, in terms of our economic infrastructure, energy and water, and then our cities and towns, which are big consumers of resources, and mobility. How do we move goods and services around the country? These were published in a suite of 8 briefing notes, which really, it's a short little read of 4 pages. It's the kind of thing you read on a flight to Cape Town, which really provides a nice overview of the opportunity in this sector. And I've provided the link below if you'd like to go and read. I'm not going to go into the detail of all of that here. Just a snapshot, for example, of some of them. We've aligned the opportunities with the 3 principles around the circular economy. So the first one, designing out waste and pollution, keeping products and materials in use, and the third, regenerating natural systems. So you can see, for example, in agriculture, we're talking about things like precision farming. How do we use less water, less nutrients or chemical fertilizers in our farming processes? Agriculture is the biggest consumer of water in South Africa. So how do we actually produce food in a more water efficient way, for example? Regenerative processes like reduced or zero till, the issues around permaculture and the opportunities. How do we farm differently? In manufacturing, resource efficiency, a lot of work that the National Cleaner Production Centre is already doing in that space, but opportunities around remanufacturing, refurbishment, repair, to grow an entirely new sector in our manufacturing economy. In our human settlements, how do we build differently? How do we create housing infrastructure for people in a less resource-intensive way? There's so much opportunity for innovation in this space. Mobility. We still move so many of our goods around this country by road, which is highly resource and carbon intensive. Why are we not shifting to rail, for example, or other forms of mobility? So there's a whole host of them, and as I said, I'm not going to go into all of the detail now, but really so many different opportunities across the different sectors to manage and to use our resources more effectively and more efficiently. We were able to do deep dive studies into 3 of those sectors, so into mining, agriculture, and into manufacturing. And in addition to just identifying the opportunities, the team also very importantly looked at where is South Africa currently in terms of readiness to implement. And what we found is that for some of the circular economy initiatives, we're already implementing them in South Africa, and we have. In some spaces, we've already been doing it for quite some time. We've just never called it circular economy. So things like composting, for example, mixed farming, where we've already got high levels of implementation and uptake of these initiatives. But also many of them, interestingly, which have very low levels of readiness and uptake. Some new ideas that have emerged on the landscape. So things like chemical leasing, digital platforms, so kind of the Ubers for agriculture. Why does every farmer own, for example, agricultural equipment to use to plow fields when it probably stands idle for maybe 50 weeks of the year? Why are we not making maximum use of our resources and sharing that kind of equipment through a sharing economy model? Digital platforms, again, so many opportunities in the agricultural space that we're seeing emerge in terms of digital platforms and how we can use that to drive a more resource efficient agricultural sector. And similarly in manufacturing, a lot of them already where we have implementations, so things like industrial symbiosis, again, NCPC, South Africa, Green Cape has been doing work in the industrial symbiosis space. We've got material looping, which is essentially our recycling. We know that we've got fairly good recycling rates for some of our waste streams, metals, paper packaging, for example, batteries, oils. Remanufacturing to some sense emerging. But then again, we've got a number of other sectors or circular economy initiatives that have a very low level of readiness. Again, the chemical leasing pops up here again. The design, interestingly, the design still came out quite low. So how do we design for circularity? A lot of opportunity and a lot of need. There was a lot of debate in terms of does green steel fit within the circular economy agenda? Is it a circular economy initiative or not? And that was a very interesting discussion to be had. So that work has been done. It's all publicly available on the URL that I provided. Where are we headed next? So we're very fortunate that the Department of Science and Innovation has provided further funding to take this into the next phase. We're now at the point of assessing the second driver. So is climate mitigation a reason for South Africa to transition to a more circular economy? We'll be quantifying that. If we implement a suite of different circular economy interventions, what is the climate mitigation potential for the country? And we'll be doing two further deep dive studies, energy and water, which, as we know, and load shedding should probably kick in sometime during the course of the morning, are both a constraint to South Africa's development. As I said, we've seen it in the Eastern and Western Cape in terms of water. We see it nationally in terms of how energy, or the lack of access, at least to electricity, is constraining South Africa's growth. So my concluding thoughts, I think if there's anything that you sort of take home from the presentation this morning, is to remember the circular economy is not about waste management. It's about how we as a country use our resources efficiently, effectively, sustainably. It really provides us with an opportunity for South Africa, and in fact, I would argue Africa, to rethink how we use our resources. Do we just simply want to provide them into the global economy for others to grow, for others to build their stock? Or do we strategically need to think about how we as a continent use our resources in the best interest of our people? Because what happens when we run out of our resources and we're still left with people in poverty, living in informal settlements, with food insecurity, what do we as a country then face in terms of our future development when we no longer have those resources? The circular economy, I do believe, provides opportunities for new businesses, for job creation. It's the one driver that we haven't quantified, and I would love, it's certainly not my area of expertise, I would love to see a study done for South Africa to actually quantify the business and job creation potential that a more circular transition can provide for the country. And then lastly, it provides us with an opportunity, I believe, to address the major social challenges that are facing us as a country. Issues around poverty, unemployment, hunger, malnutrition, food security, etc. So with that, thank you very much. And I really do encourage you, download the documents, have a read through them. And if you'd like to engage with the CSR team around any of the issues, we'd certainly love to do that. Thank you very much.
What I'm presenting is based on our global analysis, but it is a global analysis with 25 regions, of which South Africa is one. So let me put that in context immediately up front so that when you see the results, basically we have a model that has the economy of South Africa, USA, China, European Union, etc. We have the linkages, we have something like 55 sectors, I think, in the economy, and these all interact with each other. You have intermediate inputs going from one sector to the other sector. There's bilateral trade flows that link the different economies to each other. These different sectors in each economy all demand capital, demand labor, they demand materials. Mostly processed materials in most sectors, but then there's, of course, the processing sector that then demands the raw mined material. And so we're tracking the material basically from the moment where it's extracted to where it enters the economy. And then our economic model can give us an idea of how that then evolves over time. So if the processing sector doubles, the materials used for the demand for materials by the processing sector also doubles. That's the kind of the basic concept. Our results for South Africa come from a globally harmonized economic database called GTAP, which is widely used, but it is a harmonized database. It's not a series of individual deep dive studies into individual countries. So we think that, this is a reasonable projection for South Africa, but it's not a deep dive study for South Africa. So you will find numbers in there that you might not really be comfortable with, because you might have better information locally and say, well, maybe we should put this into the right context. So basically what I'm trying to say is don't pin me down on any specific number for South Africa that you see, but you may enter into discussion with me on the mechanisms that drive these numbers and then the basic qualitative conclusions that we get out of it. That's a big caveat, but I hope it's still informative. So I start with the Global Material Resources Outlook. I already did some of that yesterday morning, but we might have some new people, and I'm going to go into a little bit more detail. So basically the idea is that if our economy would keep growing and we keep using the materials in the same way as we've been using them now, we would get more than a tripling of material resource use. Economic growth leads to more materials use. But there are two opposing factors that make sure that in our baseline projection, so even without new policies, we have some sort of what we call relative decoupling of materials use and economic growth. The first one of that is structural change. This is what I talked about yesterday. This is idea that the services sector in the economy tend to grow faster than the heavy industries. And therefore, the share of the materials using sectors in the economy is going down over time. The second one is technological change. The idea, this is a wide range of things. This is labor productivity improvements, which mean that we can add more value to each production that we do, and therefore the value added to materials resource use is then growing over time. So finally, we end up with a doubling of material resource use globally from 79 in 2011 to 167 is what we project for 2060. I saw that Linda had a slide on there of the IRP Global Resources Outlook. Ours is Global Material Resources Outlook. came out roughly at the same time. We had a lot of interesting discussions with them. There are differences in the model, not in the modeling philosophy. They use a very similar type of model. They use very similar philosophy. And I think qualitatively, the conclusions are also quite the same. But it is a separate report. So for South Africa, I dug into the numbers last night, and our estimate is that it's basically below 500 megatons of raw material use in 2011, and that's up to roughly 910 is what we get for 2060. Now, this might be 800, it might be 1,000, but that's the order of magnitude. Is probably that raw material use in South Africa is below a gigaton, and will remain below a gigaton for the foreseeable future, is what our projections are. I don't have the full slide for South Africa. I tried to do that last night, but these intermediate steps are quite complicated to do, and I didn't manage. But the concept there is very much the same. I would imagine that economic growth plays a little bit of a larger role in South Africa because growth rates tend to be a bit larger than the global average, as far as I... No, but yeah, but in the future. I'm talking about the coming decades. Well, okay. Let's see how it evolves, but no, okay. Structural change is something that's important. But so anyway, I didn't do the intermediate steps, so I'm happy to be corrected on that one. So what's the basic concept of then how materials link to the economy? So I'm here using some kind of the philosophy behind it, and that is you have a GDP growth rate in the US that is roughly stable. This is a baseline that we did before COVID-19. If we redo it now, you would get a dip in 2020, a little bit of a dip in 2021, but actually a quite fast recoupling and revision back to the original growth rates is what we foresee for the global economy and also for countries like the United States. So kind of, a stable growth, but not a very high growth. And with that comes a steady increase in gross investment. And from gross investment, you get a steady increase in construction output, because for investment, you need construction materials, infrastructure build up requires construction. And of course, construction materials use then also increases. So basically, from a flat growth rate, you get a doubling of materials used through these intermediate steps, through investment, through infrastructure, construction, etc. We then compare that to China, which has a high growth rate now, and but which is rapidly declining in terms of its GDP growth rate. You see a huge amount of current investment, but you also see a leveling off of investment. But still, growth rates are sizable, so therefore you still see a growth of investment as well, and therefore a growth in construction output. And you get this kind of S-shaped curve for construction materials use, because basically this construction output is, the growth rate of that is declining over time until something like 2050, and then it picks up again as the growth rate of the Chinese economy stabilizes, and as China has to start replenishing basically all this infrastructure that they're building up right now, and they have to do a lot of refurbishment of investments, if you want to call that. And then sub-Saharan Africa. Low growth rates historically. I used to be really optimistic like 10 years ago about growth in Africa, sub-Saharan Africa. We saw growth rates in I did an analysis of growth rates for the IPCC in something like 10 years ago, and we had several years of more than 7% growth in sub-Saharan Africa. So I was kind of optimistic, and I kept telling that story until I realized that in 2015, 2016, there had been a commodity crisis. And after the commodity crisis of 2015, 2016, growth rates in South Africa, in Africa, have been very low. And this emphasizes how deeply connected overall growth rates in Africa are to global commodity prices. They play a huge role in GDP growth rates in Africa in general. You probably all know this more than I do, but that's something that at least I learned in the last few years, and I think it is an important story. But the story here for our purposes is a growth rate that is increasing. We do all our models and our latest projections also, they do see growth picking up in Africa. Now we can have a long story about governance and the influence of governance on growth rates. This is a purely economic analysis. This is about basically what we call potential GDP. So this is not necessarily materializing, but it is what we expect in terms of looking at growth opportunities in Africa. So this is about where are the productive investments that can be made, and if these are made and if these come to pass, then we do see a pickup of the growth rate in Africa in the coming decades. But of course, with an increased growth rate comes a big boost in investment and a big boost in construction output. I think we're all going to be very happy if that happens. I think we all like to use more construction materials in Africa so that we can have development, so that we can have more infrastructure, so that we can have a higher growth rate of these economies. And if you look at it in terms of levels of construction materials use, it starts from such a low level that basically, even if you have this rapid growth of the economy and of investment and construction, then still you have materials use in gigatons that is below that of the US by 2060. So yes, it's maybe a high growth rate, but high growth rates don't tell the whole story. It comes from such a low base that actually, in terms of the pressure on global resources, that's still quite limited compared to China. So structural change shifts the activity away from the materials sectors. Construction is a major materials use sector. And that's now, that is less so in 2060. We do foresee a lot less materials used per unit of construction output by 2060. This is not about, this is mostly about basically adding more value to the construction, doing it more cleverly, but also adding more labor, adding more capital to it, and therefore making more output with the same amount of materials. It's also about where you do the production. In different economies have different materials intensity of their sectors. Basically, you have used different technologies in different countries. So if the growth rate is higher in countries that use less materials for production, then overall you see a reduction in the average materials use per unit of output. But basically the story here is that looking at the diamonds, output growth is especially large in services sectors and related sectors, which have a much lower materials intensity. Now there's a story here on motor vehicles and electronics on the right-hand side because they are indirect users of materials use. So we link the materials use to where they enter the economy. And these sectors don't use the raw materials. They use the processed materials and it goes through the other steps. So it goes basically from an upstream sector that's material intensive. But of course, these do drive an increase indirectly in materials use. So we have to be careful for that. But the story still stands. Services sectors tend to grow faster than heavy industry. And with that comes a reduction in materials use. This is a picture for South Africa as we have it. Basically the same story. It's a bit more mixed across the sectors in terms of growth, but and less clear picture, I would say. But still, you see this reduction in materials use in each sector, plus a shift towards sectors that are less materials intensive. Not all materials are the same, and we do see with the construction story that. Well, let me go back. We do see that a lot of material use, raw material use, is the heavy stuff. The heavy stuff that we actually don't really care about. It's sand and gravel, and that's what we use in construction. So what we do, what the International Resource Panel does, it's counting kilotons. You weigh everything, and then assume implicitly that for environmental purposes, a ton of rare earth elements and a ton of gravel have not the same impacts, but they both contribute the same amount to this indicator, which is materials use. So basically the story from that is materials use in tonnage is a very poor indicator of environmental problems. It's a very poor indicator of resource scarcity. It's a very poor indicator of for policy advice. Yes, there's a link to resource scarcity, but you have to really dive into the different resources that we have. I think so. The 2060 numbers I think are so vague that probably you don't even see them on the slide. At least from here, I don't see them. I don't know if you see them. On the top, you see that basically it's this doubling, and there's a difference between the different materials. Some grow faster than others. The sand, gravel, and crushed rock is a big increase, but not all of them increase as rapidly. Greenhouse gas emissions related to materials management. I always struggle with this because it really depends on how you define what is related to materials management. There's so many different ways you can calculate this, and what you attribute to, in the end, all of it is related to materials use, because in the end, all our consumption contains some sort of implicit materials use. This is basically based on the same methodology as the IRP uses, and this has the idea of basically the direct use of materials, materials extraction and materials processing. So end users transport is fairly small, but energy supply is a big one. Agriculture is a big one. So those materials management emissions are a very significant part of our economy, and they're also the part that grows quite rapidly. So we see a big increase in greenhouse gas emissions from the materials management sectors. 12% of total greenhouse gas emissions, 12% of emissions associated with concrete, 12% associated with metals, and 50 gigatons associated with the materials cycle. That includes also the waste management part, for example. So then on environmental impacts, there are big differences between different sectors in the environmental impacts and between the different metals and the different materials. So we did a life cycle analysis only at the global level. This is a global average. We could not do this at the individual region level, even though we know that there are huge differences between the different countries in how they do extraction, how they do mining, how they do processing. So these numbers will be quite different for different regions. And all we can provide at this stage, and I think that's something that we need to research better, is providing this global average. And even that, I would say, it's more about the rough numbers than that we can actually calculate this really in detail. Maybe country studies is a better approach here. But the idea here is still simple. Iron is a heavily polluting materials extraction and processing, and it's increasing over time until 2060 quite a bit. Same for copper. Copper is also materials use of copper is increasing quite a bit. Now here I come back to the idea that different countries have very different processes, and I've been talking a lot with people in Chile, and they claim that these numbers are complete nonsense for them, and they say their story is, and I would love to have a discussion on that because I don't know the South African context enough to see whether the same holds for South Africa. Their story is that they're basically doing it more efficient than most of the competitors, and especially than China. And therefore, as part of a circular economy transition, some of the copper production should shift to Chile. For some metals, that might also be the case for South Africa. In some cases, we do see an increase in metals use in South Africa over time. So maybe there is a similar story there that's basically if you increase the efficiency of production, you have a chance for extractive sectors in a circular economy. Yesterday I already said that, but secondary materials are so much more environmentally friendly than primary materials. Yes, their recycling takes energy. Yes, recycling leads to environmental consequences, but really it's an order of magnitude lower if you do the life cycle analysis It's an order of magnitude lower than primary materials. So just saying, well, recycling is also using resources, is also using energy, and therefore the circular economy transition doesn't make sense. Well, that statement doesn't make sense. So then the impact of a policy. Now, unfortunately, we did only a very limited policy here. We did a material fiscal reform. So basically, we're taxing primary materials use, we're giving a subsidy to secondary metal production, and we're giving a subsidy to recycling. So this is no green public procurement, no EPRs in here. This is kind of what we consider to be the cost-effective reference point that we know countries will not be able to implement. This is not a recommendation for new policies, but this is kind of the economics reasoning. If we were to implement a cost-effective package, then this would be the results. And then if governments have reasons to adopt a different policy package, of course, results would be slightly different, but at least it gives us a good reference point across economies for this comparison in this global model. So what we see in the world, and then ranges across macro regions, basically by continent, is we see a small increase in employment, more jobs because the economy shifts towards more labor-intensive sectors. We see a small decline in GDP, with the caveat that this doesn't include any policy that directly boosts investments. So in our model, if you have to invest in green business models, that comes at the expense of investing in other growth opportunities. In practice, at least some countries claim, the US claims that quite a bit, some countries claim that you can do investments that does not come at the expense of other investment, but basically you're increasing the investment space. So if capital is a limiting factor on growth, and you can induce more investment, your overall growth rate of the economy increases, and then your GDP loss can be translated into a GDP gain. The second caveat on this GDP loss result is that it excludes damages from the environment back on the economy. So greenhouse gas emission reductions lead to lower damages from climate change. These are not factored in here. Health improvements from lower pollution levels are not factored in here. So this is really a kind of narrow economics interpretation of the GDP effect. And we're well aware of the other effects that will be there, but basically we don't feel confident with quantifying in economic terms. Then overall global metals use, we see a reduction of something in the order of 30%. And minerals use, we see less, order of magnitude 10%. And there's a very simple reason for that. And the reason is that secondary metals markets exist. Secondary steel and iron and steel is basically a quite mature market that is already there. For the non-ferrous metals, these markets do exist. They're small, but they can be scaled up. For the non-metallic minerals, this is a different story. For construction materials, to come back to that story again, construction materials in most countries, I don't know what the situation is in Africa and South Africa, but at least in Europe, for example, building regulations say that you cannot use demolished materials for new buildings. So all you can do with Europe has very strict sense of separating its source. Whenever you do a reconstruction, when you tear down a wall in your house, you have to all give that as a separate source to the waste handling facilities. It's all separated and then used as road filler. So it's downgraded very substantially, and it's downgraded so much that basically you lose most of the value in there. So doing really secondary materials for non-metallic minerals is hard, and it is something that we need more research on to see how we can manage that, because it is, I think it's a big strain on the transition to a circular economy. I looked up numbers for South Africa. They look a little bit different, and the one that's probably most surprising is the increase in metals use in Africa. And the reason for that is that we see that the circular economy transition, these taxes that we put and these subsidies on recycling and secondary materials, they actually lead to a competitiveness gain in the metals industry in South Africa compared to most of the competitors, and especially compared to China. And that competitiveness gain means a larger share of a shrinking global market. So South Africa can increase its exports of metals in this projection with this specific policy package implemented globally. In that situation, South Africa can increase its competitiveness and therefore basically boost its exports and therefore have an increase in metals use. I might come back to that later today in the trade session to look a little bit about how the trade flows are affected in this scenario. So basically, more metals reduction than minerals reduction. That's an important part of the circular economy transition that we see. And we see an increase in secondary use. Now, this is much less of an increase in secondary use than we saw yesterday for plastics. I think that is mostly due to the limited policy package that we had. We didn't do an analysis where we said, suppose you need to be fully circular. I don't think we can ever be fully circular, but suppose we try to get as close as possible, what would be needed for that? This is not that type of analysis. This is the type of analysis. What do we think might be a plausible tax rate on raw materials, subsidy rates, that's revenue neutral, and that gives us this result. So this is not where we want to be, but this is somewhere in between where we might end up if we take circular economy transition serious, but still limit our policy ambitions. So the big mining countries, Indonesia is the one on the far left. That's the most negatively affected in terms of mining industry. Then we have other Africa, and South Africa here is on the right-hand side. So we see a shift towards South Africa in terms of mining. I think we can have a discussion on how robust that result is, but I think that the story here is a realignment of production patterns across regions goes a long way in reducing global materials use. It may lead to more materials use in specific regions, but it does contribute to a reduction in overall global materials use. So the costs of the transition, I'm actually going to skip that because of time. Basically, the cost of the transition are, well, we had 20 minutes extra, Chair, no? Sorry. Look, it says conclusions. Basically, the cost story is very similar to what I presented yesterday on the plastics, and that is costs are limited, but there are significant costs, especially in non-OECD countries. So we need financing mechanisms in order to achieve those. But given that the whole construct of the policy package was a little bit artificial, I would say, I don't think that the policy conclusions from that slide are very interesting. So basically, it is possible to decouple resource use from economic growth. We do get a stabilization of resource use and at much lower levels than in the baseline. And large part of that is driven by circularity for metals. We can talk about circularity for biomass. I always find that a little bit of a difficult concept to grasp. Composting, of course, is a part of that, but metals is circular. Secondary metals basically is a key pillar. The second key pillar is reducing materials use for those things that we don't have secondary markets, where you cannot make the material circular itself. So this leads to a significant reduction in environmental impacts, including air pollution, greenhouse gas emissions, local air pollutant near mining sites. We had a global forum on environment on mercury 2 weeks ago. Mercury use in artisanal gold mining is a big problem, and we have to be very careful with that. So also there, reducing gold mining might be has to be part of a circular economy transition. And we find synergies between non-metallic minerals and fossil fuels. there isn't, if you add I didn't present this that much, if you add an energy transition to the circular economy transition, it is for non-metallic minerals, you get a synergy. You can do basically both together at a cheaper way than when you do both individually. For metals, it's a bit more complicated story because of the energy use in secondary metals as well. So, but I didn't show you the detailed results. We do find that material taxes, this material tax reform is government budget neutral. So basically it's about taxing the bad stuff, subsidizing the good stuff with these tax revenues. You can do that, doesn't cost money net. And that does give you a big environmental gain. So that is from an economics perspective, that's a non-brainer. So yes, final remark is, it is country specific. You need to dive deep into the country analysis to come up with concrete policy suggestions for the individual countries. And that's why we're so happy to be partnering with CSIR yesterday and today, because they do exactly that type of deep dive that needs to be done. All we can provide is a global context. The trade story, the international context is essential. We have interesting things happening in South Africa because of circular economy policies outside of South Africa. We have to keep those in mind. But in order for concrete policy advice, you do need the country deep dive. Thank you.
We just heard from Rob already about our global materials outlook and essentially, you know, where we're headed in terms of materials use, where we potentially are heading when we have a policy package in place to reduce this global materials use. But there's also an important social dimension, of course, to this whole transition of the circular economy. And I think this session and my presentation will go a little bit more into the labor market consequences of a transition to a circular economy. So, I mean, for this presentation and the numbers I show, the same caveat applies then for the one that Rob did. So we have the same model. The model is a global CGE model. It is broken down into 25 regions, and South Africa is one of those regions, but it is to be taken with a bit of a grain of salt, the results for South Africa, because those results are essentially just one part of a global projection. Right, but with this, I maybe start for now. So distributional impacts are important in any transition, in a low carbon transition, but just as well in a circular economy transition. And many circular economy roadmaps, in fact, emphasize the job potential of a transition. So the EU circular economy package mentions that the transition to a more circular economy can lead to 170,000 direct job gains by 2035. The French roadmap mentions 300,000 job creations. And also, I mean, Marco, you already mentioned the Finnish roadmap. The Finnish roadmap also emphasizes the job potential that it can come with the circular economy, and mentions a number of 75,000 job gains. However, the transition to a circular economy can not only lead to job gains in sectors, but it can also affect certain sectors negatively, of course. Those are sectors that have potentially an economic decline as a result of the circular economy. So it is important to look at the labor market consequences overall, and not only at the job gains, but also at the job losses and the job shifts, and to have an overall picture in terms of what are the social consequences of the transition to a more circular economy. So this presentation is based on 2 papers that we've did. So we've had a work package on this, and it essentially breaks down into a first paper looking into what does the literature tell us about labor market implications of the circular economy. So we had a broad review of existing modeling studies and what comes out of that. And then after that, we have also deployed our own model and looked into what are the labor market consequences that come out of our projections that we do. So also the presentation I do is broken up into those two aspects. So how do policies induce changes on the labor markets? I mean, if you look from left to right here, any sort of policies, not only circular economy policies, but any sort of policy change will affect different drivers in the economy. It will lead to changes in production modes, changes in demand patterns, changes in aggregate income and macroeconomic conditions, but also changes in international trade and competitiveness. And all of these drivers of the economy can have partial effects on the labor markets. So they can have, they can lead to job creations in certain sectors. They can lead to job substitutions. So where you have certain jobs replaced by a different type of job in the same sector or a different sector, they can lead to job losses. But they can also lead to job redefinitions. So where a similar job is kind of just slightly changes its purpose. So overall, these partial effects will lead to an aggregate labor market impact of a circular economy globally as well as in countries. So looking at the current structure of the economy can help to identify where those labor effects may take place. And this is quite an interesting graph. I mean, it's the global picture, but what you see here is the cumulative shares of materials use and employment per sector. So if you go from left to right on the x-axis, you have the cumulation of materials use in the blue line, which adds up to 100%, and then also the cumulation of employment, which adds up to 100%. And essentially what you can see is that the sectors with the most materials use, so the 4 sectors here on the right, that they add up to using almost 90% of the materials use. However, those sectors only employ a relatively small share of global employment. So they only employ around 15% of the employment. So where you see the largest employments, but relatively small materials use in the services sectors, which is here in orange. So yeah, there you see a big jump in employment, and also in government services, but those have relatively smaller materials used. So globally, if you have a circular economy transition that roughly shifts from more material extraction to more a service-based economy, you will end up with a larger employment, but you will also have, you will likely have a decline in the more materials-intensive sectors, but that will only have an effect of a relatively small share of the overall employment globally. So as part of this review study, we have looked into what is the literature saying about the labor market implications of a circular economy. And we have looked into 15 different modeling studies and reviewed in total 47 scenarios, and to see what are the projected labor impacts. And I mean, a standardized comparison between modeling studies and between modeling scenarios is always a little challenging because, of course, they're all based on different assumptions. They have different time periods, different scopes, sometimes even use different models. So these are all caveats, but we've all converted them into materials intensity just to give a rough idea of what would be the outcome from those studies. And what we see from those studies is that overall in the literature, it is projected that the transition to a more resource efficient and circular economy will have a net positive effect on employment. And that net positive effect ranges in most studies between 2 to 3%. There's one study that projects employment gains up to 7%, but most studies estimate a net employment gain around 2%. So what is also important and what came out of the review is, so overall employment, it is possible to reduce material intensity with a gain in employment. So to lead to a more circular and resource efficient economy with a net positive effect on employment. However, what is clearly coming out of those studies is the way how the tax revenues, so most modeling studies implement, as Rob also said, implement a materials tax on in their scenario, and the way how those revenues of those taxes are used in the system really drives the employment result. So if those tax revenues are used as part of an environmental tax reform, where they are being reinvested to reduce distortionary labor taxes, then the employment result is higher, and this can lead to a net positive effect. So the scenarios that have an environmental tax reform in place have on average a positive employment effect of 2.3%, where this tax revenue is not used to reduce distortionary labor taxes, but just fed back into the economy. There, the employment effect is much less, so 0, even slightly negative, so 0.07. I've looked up into those scenarios. So an important outcome here is that it's when you have a transition, you really need to look into and you implement a tax and materials tax to drive towards reduced materials use. It's important to also think how you use those tax revenues and what you subsidize with it in order to reduce the labor market implications. What's also important to recognize is that job losses and gains can be more significant in certain sectors. So I've been talking about the net employment gain, but certain sectors can, of course, have larger job gains, but also larger significant job losses. So the main messages that come out of the review of the modeling studies is that the reviewed studies suggest that there can be a net positive effect on employment ranging between 0 and 3%, depending on the study. Important again to highlight that the allocation of the revenues that are being generated from materials taxes really matters. So reducing labor taxes can help improve employment outcomes. Also, that labor impacts are likely to be asymmetric within and across countries. The specialization and composition of local economies plays an important role on how the transition play out. Another thing that is less discussed in those studies is aspects around job quality, job duration, and gender. So those are also important aspects that are worth to be discussing. They're sometimes difficult to quantify, but like, if you, for instance, have a circular economy, but like the job gains are really just in the waste sector, then you can have a discussion about what is the quality of those jobs. If you have a transition to a more circular economy, you may have job gains in certain sectors that are required to build up this transition. But once you reach to this new state of a circular economy, those jobs may be lost again. So you maybe have jobs that are just required for the transition process rather than for the new circular economy itself. So there are also a discussion around job duration is also important. And of course, something that is hardly discussed in any of those studies is the gender aspect. So who is implicated by those labor implications, where are those job creations being created, and how does that play out for gender? So then, as a second part, we have used our CGE model to look into what do the projections that we have done at the OECD in our modeling, what do they say about the labor market implications? And I mean, this is something that Rob already said. This is our business as usual projections. So our baseline scenario essentially, which projects that the global economy will triple by 2060, but global growth overall will slow down. So this story may be different for the African continent, but globally the global growth will slow down. Materials use is going to double despite relative decoupling between growth and materials use. So what we see is that materials intensity will reduce. We become more efficient in using materials, but overall materials use will still grow. The economic growth is accompanied with a mild employment growth. And this we have broken down here. You can see it into the different sectors. And what you see is that, I mean, Africa is in this scenario part of the light blue rest of world. You see that there the employment growth is projected to be highest in the baseline scenario. So when you look into the different sectors and how employment is affected in a different sector in the baseline scenario, you see that the change in the structure of the economy will also impact employment in different sectors differently. So there will be a shift from resource-intensive materials towards more the service-based sector, as the global economy will drive towards more servitization. And this will result in a net employment gain in certain service-based economies, but also in sectors that are required for the transition process. So for instance, renewable power and generation, which we see here all the way on the left. Then there's job losses projected in the more materials intensive and extractive sectors. So here you have, for instance, non-metallic minerals or fabricated metal products, more the manufacturing, where you have projected job losses in OECD countries. So the results that we see for South Africa, I mean, this is again just an extraction of what the global model says about South Africa. This is based on the output projections that Rob has already mentioned. Output is expected to grow for South Africa, and as a result of that, there will also be an employment gain. So there is an net employment gain projected for nearly all sectors. Even the extractive sectors, which, as Rob said, are projected to become more competitive on the global scale, and therefore will also lead to more output. So then we've looked into what does this material fiscal reform, so this policy package that we have modeled, what does this policy package imply for the employment results and the employment implications. So we have conducted the employment study with the same material fiscal reform that we also looked at in the previous study. And I mean, Rob already went into the slide, and he said overall it's possible to reduce metal use and mineral use, so to decouple resource use from GDP. And all this can happen with a net positive globally, with a slight net positive employment effect. But this effect is 0 to 0.5, and this will depend very much on the different sectors, which I will talk about in the next slides. However, I mean, if you break this down, the net effect may be close to 0 or 0.1, but the effect in terms of job creations and job destructions is larger, and also that depends on the different regions. So what you see is, whilst the net employment effect is 0.01 or 0.05, the total job reallocations, which we define as the sum of job creations and job destructions, can be larger. And that can be larger also in certain regions, in the emerging economies and in the rest of the world, as those countries transition from a more materials intensive economy to an economy that builds up their services sector. There will be a larger job reallocation from those materials intensive sectors to the services sectors. So overall, we project that in terms of absolute numbers, that the policy will result in 10 million job creations and 8 million job disruptions globally to 2040. So this is a relatively, overall seen on the global market, this is a relatively small number. If you look into differences across different countries, you can see that this employment effect will depend on the underlying economic structure that those countries will have. So Rob already showed results for output effects. So this is the same here, that those countries that have a large extraction sector, which is projected to decline, will also have a negative effect on employment. So this is Indonesia in particular, and Australia here, that is projected to have slight employment decreases. However, and then if you see at the same time the countries in Europe and USA, as those countries are increasing to reuse and to recycle the materials domestically that they have, so as they are becoming more efficiently in using the stock that they have built up, they will be less reliant on importing raw materials in a circular economy, and therefore they will have more job creations in those secondary materials sectors in their countries here. So this is what you can see here in the job gains for those countries. South Africa's projections are again based on the story of becoming more competitive on the global market. So there we see that for South Africa, the net effect will be to have a slight job gain in around like 0.15 to 0.1 to 0.15% in job gains compared to the baseline scenario. So here you see the employment results broken down by the global results broken down by different sectors. And this is again the same story, that whilst you have the net effect, which is relatively small, which is the top bar here, so the positive effects minus the small effects, you can see that the reallocation, so the effects that are happening within the different sectors, can be larger than the net effects. So you can see here that globally there is an increase in secondary metals in energy and in the services sectors, but this is compensated by job losses in the more materials intensive sectors, so minerals, primary metals, mining and extraction, and construction. So here again, we have also pulled out the results for South Africa. And in South Africa, compared to the global results, the effect is around 0.1.5% in South Africa. The employment effects are, in terms of magnitude, a little larger, so we're talking about 0.3%, but it's still relatively small. But like the big difference is that you see here, whilst in the global results, primary metals was projected as a net employment, as an employment loss. Here, because of this story of increasing their competitiveness, we also project an increase in employment gains in the primary metals, so this jumps up. And otherwise, the story is relatively similar. So you have job losses in the materials intensive sectors, in mining and construction. You have gains in the recycling industry, and you have also gains in the services sector as we move towards a more service-based economy. So some of the findings that come out of the modeling work that we have done is that the projected employment effect of the policy action is well within the range of the literature. So it fits in terms of story. It fits with what the literature is saying, that there will be a net job employment gain globally, but that this employment gain is relatively marginal. So the material fiscal reform policy package implies a job gain, so a job creation of 10 million jobs globally and job losses of 8 million jobs by 2040. But however, even though this net impact is relatively small, some sectors are likely to be affected more heavily, both in terms of job creations. So you have job creations in sectors that are being boosted by the circular economy, and job losses where those sectors are likely having a decline or at least a slower growth compared to the business as usual. So those are the extractive sectors, primary materials, non-metallic materials, and also the construction sector. In terms of policy messages that come out of our projections, is that in order to maintain public support throughout the transition process towards a circular economy, it's really important to look into those sectoral shifts of the labor market. So to not only talk about the net employment gain and the job creations that a circular economy can bring about, but to also really acknowledge, besides the positive effects, also the potential negative effects that can happen in certain sectors. And then also think about certain policy measures that can help to absorb this negative effect that the transition of a circular economy can have on sectors where we expect job losses or a slower, a reduced growth in output. And policies that are worth considering here are policies that help to reskill workers to allow them to shift quicker into other jobs, help them to upskill to compete more successfully in those other job sectors where we're expecting a higher growth. So with that, I am done.
So I'll try to be. I have a lot to cover, so just tell me when I'm running out of time. So basically, one strand of our work is about how do we embed the circular economy transition into trade, and how do we embed trade into the circular economy transition. The key questions is, how can trade contribute to a more resource efficient circular economy, and in what ways can we secure policy coherence to facilitate the circular economy transition? So policy coherence is basically the term I think that we're talking about. We have a bunch of reports that went into this, a lot of them by my colleague Shunta Yamaguchi, who is really an expert on trade and circular economy. Basically, if you look at the linear way of producing, from design all the way to waste, we have these feedback links: recycling, refurbishment, reuse, repair, etc., eco-design. So that's all within a national boundary. But we have global supply chains. We do have most of these this linear economy is actually cross-border. There's a lot of differentiation. We have trade in second-hand goods, trade in goods for refurbishment and remanufacturing, trade in waste for recovery, trade in secondary raw materials. Not huge flows in the latter. So basically, and I'm going to be really, export flows and import flows, trade flows don't necessarily always follow the different production sectors. Now here's a small trick here. It's when you see aluminium, for example, primary aluminium production globally declines, secondary aluminium production goes up. But what do we measure in the trade flow is aluminium, and there is no distinction how the production process is made in our trade statistics. So therefore, the trade flow is just the sum of primary and secondary. So that's why the exports, the global exports, are actually increasing, but that's basically a shift from primary to secondary. And obviously, recycling is increasing also. So how much do we get in terms of materials use reductions? How much of that is coming from trade flows? It's kind of complicated slide, but I'll try to talk through it very quickly. We identify here three effects. One is the scale effect. Basically, do you produce more of the commodity? The second one is an efficiency effect. How much of the material do you use for that production? And the third one is the trade effect, and that is about, do you source it, your inputs, from a different location? Do you source it? And is the production itself from a different location? And can you gain materials use reductions from that? So what we see is that in most cases, aluminium, copper, non-ferrous metals, we do see a big role for changing international trade patterns as part of the solution to become more circular from a global perspective. We do see a big role there, much less so for iron and steel, but that is basically because that is already a quite advanced market for secondary materials. So therefore, there's less of a scope there's less of a difference in the sense that there's less opportunities to reap efficiency gains from sourcing it from a different place because the market is more mature. Then for South Africa on the left, let me start on the right, the same story with the scale effect, the efficiency effect and the trade effect, but different stories in terms of different materials. And you see here that we project an increase in copper production in South Africa. We already saw that the metal sector was increasing, but it's a shift from aluminium to copper, basically, and from iron and steel towards copper. So we see more exports of copper, less of the other metals. And then you get these trade effects that then kind of compensate for that in some way. On the left-hand side is what maybe is a bit more intuitive and more interesting is what's the effect of your domestic policy, what's the effect of other countries having a policy, and what's the effect overall. So if we start with the dark blue, the domestic policy effect, so the effect if South Africa would implement the policy on its own, nobody else would do a circular economy policy, it would have a reduction in GDP, but an increase in exports and imports. And so we see that this material fiscal reform and this specific combination of taxes and subsidies together can boost materials exports in South Africa, and that is from the copper. But then if you add to that the effect of an international policy, so the idea that other countries also do a circular economy transition, they also implement these taxes and they also implement these subsidies, what you see is that in general, for materials exports, that leads to even further opportunities for South Africa because basically the primary copper in other countries becomes more expensive, a competitiveness gain from South Africa in that sense. But the opposite holds for the material imports. If other countries implement these policies, they will get their production of materials will become more expensive, and South Africa will have less incentive to import these. So then trade policies and the multilateral trade regime. We have a bunch of multilateral trade rules, non-discrimination. We have some general exceptions, technical barriers to trade agreements. And as I already said, the trade and environmental sustainability structured discussions. This is still informal, but there is a big multilateral discussion going on. I mean, we all seen the plastics negotiations now starting. We're having discussions, negotiations on climate, of course. So there is a multilateral track. It had been fairly small and fairly slow until recently, but it seems to be gaining track again. And what we saw instead in the last 15 years or so is that a lot of, especially OECD countries, are signing regional trade agreements with other countries, with each other, but also with developing countries to advance their trade policies. And a bunch of them have environmental provisions. Most of them have environmental provisions, and a bunch of them actually have circular economy provisions. So the UK-New Zealand FTA has provisions on eco-design, information, labeling, and quality standards. The EU-United Kingdom Trade and Cooperative Agreement has something on circular economy, and there are a few that are in draft form. So basically, there are circular economy provisions. So there's at least a subgroup of countries that are using bilateral trade negotiations to advance where they think they cannot reach enough in the multilateral tracks. If you ask our countries, what kind of provisions for resource efficiency and circular economy, what kind of policies do you have in mind, and what are you planning? What have you already implemented? And we see a number of groups. EPR and product stewardship is very high on the list. This is OECD countries. Taxes and subsidies form a large part of it. Eco-design is part of that. Procurement is part of it. Eco-labeling is part of it. and standards are part of it. And all these then come back in trade agreements. This is OECD countries' policies only. It's basically a survey of our own members. But it does give you quite clear links on what kind of things our governments want to implement and how they want to use multilateral and bilateral trade policy to advance on those elements. So trade can contribute to circular economy via economies of scale. I think I said that already yesterday. The idea is that not every country can scale up circular business models, and you do need international trade in order to reap these economies of scale that you have, and that is something that is important. Circular economy concepts should extend to supply chains. Circular economy opportunities for end-of-life value chains is a difficult area. As I said, trade in waste is complicated from a trade perspective and from a customs perspective. Trade in services is something that we don't talk about a lot, but actually that is very much an area that supports the transition to a circular economy. If we don't have trade in services, that means we don't have trade in the people that can tell businesses how to make their business more sustainable. That involves, there's a lot of services involved in the circular economy transition. So by helping companies learn from each other, helping specialized services firms to intervene, helping the trade in environmental services is very important from a circular economy, global circular economy perspective. But of course, we do need transparency and traceability of value chains. And this is, I mean, digital economy can help with this, blockchain can help with transparency, but it is slow going. I've seen discussions, international discussions on standards, and everybody agrees we need to harmonize, and nobody agrees how to harmonize or what to harmonize to. Those are always coming back. Can the OECD not provide us with a definition of X or Y? And then we say, sure, as soon as you agree on what you want, we can write it up. But so that's really where a lot of the negotiations have to take place, figuring out what kind of standardization can you get and what kind of, even can you agree on definitions? And that's hard, but that requires international negotiations. Then I'm gonna, so basically towards a mutually supportive agreement, agenda is really about promoting trade, finding better definitions and classifications, better standards, better regulations, or at least no harmonizing on the regulations. There's a lot of companies that we talk to that are very frustrated with individual governments finding labeling requirements, for example, that are unharmonized across countries. So you have to then redo a lot of testing to apply for a certain label. You have to redo the testing for each individual country. So there's a big cost associated with that. You have to either adapt your product to the individual markets, or you have to at least adapt the packaging for it to comply with packaging labeling, etc. There's a huge gain to be reaped from international harmonization of standards and labels, etc. So that will help with trade, and that way trade can help with the circular economy transition. And with that, I thank you.
This workshop has been really, really insightful for I hope every other of the participants, as well as for us, Rob and me, but also for other speakers, I guess. I will focus on, I think I noted down 3 or 4 points that I want to talk about. I think on day one, we have started talking mostly about plastics. And I think I noted down a quote, which I like quite a bit, that in like the South African context, I think you said that we need to move away from picking waste to a more comprehensive collection and recycling infrastructure. So we need to move away from just cherry picking what is the high value at the moment, but really look at building up a comprehensive infrastructure that collects waste and that disposes it safely. And the primary goal there is really to avoid leakage and to also ensure public health. So to ensure that this is going to sanitary landfills and does not create any health hazards. The financing of this infrastructure is, of course, important, and we've looked into ways to better implement the polluter pays principle through, for instance, EPR. So how can we make producers a bit more responsible about the waste that they put on the markets? And I mean, CSIR has done a study that EPR can be beneficial to reduce plastic pollution by up to 30%, I think what came out of the study. So that's promising. But besides that, there's also a need for additional financing. And I think it was clear that some of that financing, or at least also some help, is needed from the international community through official development aid. So this can be capacity building in terms of how to build up infrastructure, how to develop strong and robust policies, as well as also some financing to contribute to the substantial costs that are needed to build up this infrastructure to avoid waste leakage. In terms of the international community, I mean, it's clear that this is plastics leakage is high on the international community right now. It's you know, the INC process that's going on, and we are involved in it, as well as South Africa, as well as the European Commission. So I think there it's good to see that we're all working together. We're all on the same page that we want to mitigate the leakage of plastics. We want to move towards a more circular plastics use. And we want to overall just reduce the environmental impacts that using plastics is generating. So yeah, we are excited to work on this further and to see what's coming out. So today, then we move more into just global resource use in general, away from plastics, but more materials used globally. I mean, the global picture informs where we're headed, and the global materials resource outlook that we have done really shows that materials use is going to grow, and it's going to more than double globally. So it's important to look into ways to use materials more efficient, and to also reduce environmental impacts that come from that materials use. I think what became clear out of the discussion also is that it's important to emphasize that moving to a circular economy globally as well as locally does not mean that it should reduce materials use that is needed for developing the more emerging and developing economies. So there's still resources needed for developing economies to continue to develop. And I think that's important to acknowledge that there should also be space made for using those resources to allow them to develop further. But it's at the same time also important to look into ways of how this can be done with reduced environmental impacts. So how can we look into ways to, for instance, opportunities to reduce environmental impacts and to develop in a more resource efficient way? So how can we look into ways to reduce environmental impacts from extraction processes, for instance, which is a big sector in South Africa? But also, how can we look into opportunities for leapfrogging? So look into opportunities to build up the infrastructure that is needed in the development world. So like to build up the stock that is needed, to build this up already with a circular mind, with a circular goal in mind. So for instance, we see that in European countries, we have built up a huge stock of materials and the buildings and the buildings infrastructure, for instance, but much of that cannot be used at the moment, or only very limitedly be used as secondary materials because it's downgraded and it can only be used as rubble. So how can we build up this construction and infrastructure stock already in mind with reuse and recycling at the end of the life? So I think that's important to look into ideas and best practices that are coming out and implement them early on as African countries and South Africa are developing. In terms of global resources, I mean, we just had a final discussion on trade and the trade implications. So what are those trade effects for the local economy, for employment, and for resource use? And also a bit of a thought, where do we want to specialize? So I think the goal is to have a bit of that value added and the employment that comes with it more domestically, but where do we want to specialize to really create a competitive advantage for South Africa to allow it to develop in those sectors further? That leads to the final point that I want to make, and I think one that became clear was that the circular economy transition or at least the transition everywhere, but especially also in South Africa, is not only about reducing resources and reducing environmental impacts, but it's also about the social dimension. So it's really about ensuring that the transition is just and to look into the labor implications that come out of that. So we have shown some global results, and globally we see that the labor implications of a transition to a circular economy are relatively marginal. I think we all concluded that for South Africa, it may look a little different because the structure of the economy currently is quite different to the global economy. And I think we included that it's worth to have a deep dive there and to have a really detailed country-specific study. But I hope it was still useful to show those results that we have done. And I think the work that the OECD has done is still valuable in the sense that it provides a sound methodology and some inspiration on how we can go about in doing this country-specific study. So it touches upon various topics that need to be regarded in terms of labor mobility, in terms of the modeling aspects. So I think this can provide some inspiration to work further on a deep dive and a country-specific study with specifically on the African context or the South African context in terms of the social implications. But what has become clear is that it's important to look in labor mobility and to see how we can absorb the job losses that may come about with the circular economy transition. So how do we go and anticipate this to absorb it? How do we implement early on the reskilling that is needed to ensure labor mobility and to ensure that we can absorb the job losses as well as accelerate the job gains and further stimulate the positive impacts that the circular economy can bring about. That is a bit on the content that I wanted to summarize. I mean, there's surely more to summarize, but those are the 3 points that I wanted to make. Just overall, I mean, I personally wanted to thank everyone for the discussion. I think for me it was really, really interesting, and I have learned a lot, and I hope you guys also come out with some insights from that. I think it's important to learn from other countries, from experiences that other countries have done. Maybe other countries have faced similar challenges in the past, and have got some learning outcomes out of that. So I think this workshop has provided a bit of that, some experiences that other countries have done. Our reports are full of best practice examples, so I really recommend you to look into detail of the reports to see best practice examples, and we are happy to connect you to relevant delegates if you want to follow up with specific countries about specific best practice examples, but also to keep on following work that we do. So now with COVID-19, we have moved a lot to virtual workshops, virtual meetings, etc. So it's becoming a lot more accessible to actually access this knowledge also that the OECD is doing. So we have a newsletter at the OECD that you can follow, and there's usually featured of what events we participate in, what events we are publishing ourselves. So I encourage you to subscribe to that, and then to also follow some of the webinars that may be relevant to your work. With regards to webinar, this is my last point. Sorry. Someone else has been talking about the workshops at the WCEF. And I also wanted to mention that we are also involved in an accelerator session at the WCEF. And that is an accelerator session specifically on EPR, and best practices on how to implement EPR. And this we do together with the EEB, so the European Environment Bureau, with the Green Growth Institute, Closing the Loop, and UNEP. So I think this should be already the first start to, start following some of our webinars, which could definitely provide some useful insights. It's happening on Thursday, the 8th of December, for the ones that are in Kigali. I think it's happening in person in the Kigali Marriott Hotel, but there's also an online stream, and it's effectively a hybrid event. So we will not be in Kigali. We will be joining and presenting there virtually.
I'm extremely happy you asked Fritz first, because that was a very nice summary, and I'm not going to repeat my summary. I had noted down 2 questions for the final that we should follow up on, and that is, should we export materials to boost development versus keep the materials domestic? And the second one is, how do we manage the structural change in our economies that we want from an environmental policy? We want our future economies to look different than they do today. How do we manage that, and how do we make that happen smoothly? In both cases, first answer is be proactive. Understand what's coming at you. Sorry, got slightly distracted there. You have to understand what's coming at you so that you can participate in it, deal with it, manage it as well as you can. So if you don't invest now in the transition to a circular economy, you will have stranded assets in a few decades, and you will have a lot of lost investments that basically becomes worthless once the whole world is transitioning to a low carbon circular economy. So you do need to understand now where to invest in a way that is carbon proof and that is circular economy proof. And otherwise you're not getting anywhere. Whether that development pathway that you need to design proactively, whether that involves exporting raw materials, exporting processed materials, keeping more of it domestically, that's a good question. But development pathways are always difficult to design, and you can never get it absolutely right up front. So you do need to be versatile in the way you structure your economy and the incentives that you give as a government to business, and to facilitate opportunities as they spring up. Whether, let me make a strawman argument, keeping all the materials domestically because that gives you more value domestically. If South Africa keeps all its platinum inside its borders and doesn't export any of it, I think it becomes worthless. I think it will not be helpful at all, and it will not be helpful for South Africa, it will not be helpful for the world. You do need to trade. If you have a relative abundance of a resource, you do need to trade to make that value work for you. The second question on how do we manage the structural change from environmental policy? And this is about talking to finance ministries, talking to industry. I'm very sorry that the ministry is not here this morning to engage in that discussion. And I understand they had a very good reason for that. So this is not a blame game, but they need to be part of this discussion. This is not an environment discussion, this is an economy discussion. And we need the economy, we need to talk to finance ministries, economics ministries, and we need to talk about jobs, and we need to talk about economic growth. And we need to talk that if you want to sustain job growth and economic growth, you need to do that in an environmentally sound manner, because otherwise you get back to what I said before, that you're preparing yourself for an economy of the future, of the past instead of the economy of the future. The OECD does a lot in terms of peer learning from how do governments, best practices, how do governments learn from each other. I'm very happy that Gauta is a regular visitor to Paris to participate in our discussions on circular economy and other environment economy integration discussions, because you do learn best, not from OECD Secretariat that does a global study and that then says, oh, we think this is going to happen to the global economy. That's a good context. But if you want to know how to design your EPR, talk to countries that have designed an EPR. Talk to them, see how to do it, see the pitfalls that they fell into, see what pitfalls to avoid, what opportunities to grasp. Peer learning, understanding best practices from other countries, that's the way to design better policies. And of course, you need to adapt those to your local circumstances. But you should be able to understand your local circumstances, hopefully yourself, better than an external organization can.
I'm not as well prepared as you both, so I'm just going through it. and I will try to really summarize it up very quickly. I think yesterday we talked very nicely about plastics, and I think Solve Plastics for Africa is such a nice initiative. And I think as ACEN, we really want to reach out to the different countries that we have in Africa to see which are the countries that we can model for next. I think that's something that the people online, please take that into consideration and reach out to us as well. I do think that the studies from the OECDs really show us also what we need to do and the homework that we need to bring home and what we need to apply for our context. We do need collaboration in every sense. So not only within Africa and South Africa, but also internationally. So we really need to foster those relationships. But I do also think we need to talk more in Africa ourselves. So as I think Ariane said, we are good from the South African context to engage with our overseas partners. We do need to do that more in Africa. Because yes, South Africa has the evidence baseline and certain data, and other countries are completely lacking in that sense. So we do need to work on that. Chris mentioned online that the circular economies also always should have a positive effect on environment, the economy, and people. And I think we need to also be clever how we define the circular economy for South Africa. So I think we need to work a little bit around the definition as well. Yeah, and I think the transition to a circular economy is really going to be a teething process for South Africa. It's a teething process for each of the countries. It's going to be painful. It's going to be very tricky. And I think we need a lot of people coming together from the different departments, from the different NGOs, from the different academic sectors to actually make it happen. And at the end of the day, we don't really have another choice, do we? So if we want to build a future that's prosperous, that's the way to go. And it's going to come with its challenges. But on the other hand, we, I think, have those collaborators in hand that we can actually learn from and that we can transfer those lessons learned. I think for South Africa, we need some kind of circular economy task force team. I'm not being a political speaker here, but I think that's something to maybe consider. And yeah, other than that, I really want to thank the OECD and obviously the CSIR for making this workshop happening. And we hope to really see you at the World Circular Economy Forum, which happens from the 6th, the 7th, and then also the 8th of December. So that's relatively soon. Thank you.
I think the key messages for me, we started yesterday talking about plastic and plastic pollution, and it came very much from the perspective of the environment. What do we do to drive circularity to address a significant pollution problem that is facing us globally? And it was interesting in terms of the alignment that we were seeing between the global model that the OECD presented on and the work that William presented on in terms of the Pathways tool. Very much this, there is no silver bullet. We require both upstream and downstream interventions to get us to addressing the leakage of plastic into the environment. And as part of that, how we grow circularity, how we address the issues of product design and design for circularity going forward. And I think today was really incredibly insightful for me because it was completely out of my comfort zone. I'm not an economist. I know nothing about trade. If the economy depended on me buying things, it would completely fall apart because I hate shopping. So it was incredibly insightful to see just how much influences this discussion around the circular economy from an economic, a trade perspective. And I think because at the heart of it, what we're talking about is how we use resources within our economy and how do we shift towards sustainable resource use. I think that in the discussion then what came out for me was this issue of how does the circular economy benefit all countries, North and South, that we don't have winners and losers. I think Rob spoke to the fact that everybody needs to make this transition towards circularity. It can't just be one country on its own. And the question is, how do we do that in a way that benefits all moving forward? And then I do absolutely agree the point, Fritz, that you made in terms of how can we build up our stock with circularity in mind? I think that's such an important question for Africa as we move forward. Someone said to me recently, and I'm not sure what emotion I have attached to it. Someone said to me that the divide in Africa is too great to leapfrog to circularity. And I think my immediate response was one of anger. And then there was a part of, well, maybe it is, and there was a bit of denial. But part of me is still hopeful that we can develop a different, or we can move along a different development path in Africa that has circularity at the heart of it, that has sustainable resource use at the heart of it. And I think the point that you made around how do we build our stock with circularity in mind is so important, because we have to address these key socio-economic issues and challenges that are facing our continent. Issues around decent housing, around job creation, around poverty, around food security. These are fundamental issues that we have to address on the continent. And we are such a resource-rich continent that I cannot, I just sometimes can't believe that we deal with these big socio-economic challenges, just given the opportunities that we have and the resources that we have available. And then I think the last point, the last message for me was the importance of the country-specific economic study. And I think that's my question, is almost fantastic work that we've seen from the OECD. How do we take that learning and how do we do something like that for South Africa to actually come up with a deep dive economic study into truly understanding the economic opportunities, the benefits, the potential risks that might lay ahead of us in a circular economy transition. There's definitely been a lot of learning. There's still a lot that I need to digest. I'm certainly going to go back to the recordings of the last 2 mornings and work through them again. We will make the presentations available online for delegates to revisit and to look through. I know, Rob, you made the very kind offer that anyone who's attended the workshop who would like access to the reports, I don't know if you want them to contact you. You might be flooded with emails. You have already. Because I know someone on the chat had said, how do we get access, because you've got to create an account, etc. So thank you very much for that kind offer, and I'm sure people will definitely contact you. And so I think just in closing, I would like to really give a very big thank you to Rob, to Fritz, also to the other OECD colleagues back in Paris that unfortunately couldn't be with us this morning as well. It's been wonderful working with you leading up to the workshop. I've certainly learned a lot from the presentations, and I look forward to reading through all of the resources that you have provided links for. They're on the back page of the agenda if anyone is interested. Also to our thought partners in this, the European Union and the different member states, to the African Circular Economy Network as well for partnering with us on this. I hope I haven't forgotten anyone. The Department of Forestry, Fisheries and Environment, who so kindly gave a number of presentations yesterday and has always been fully supported and committed to the circular economy transition. To all of the presenters who presented both virtually and in person today, a huge thank you for your incredibly insightful presentations and for keeping to time in most instances. To our chairs, Ariane, Katerina, thank you very much for chairing our 2 mornings. And then last, and certainly by no means least, to all of the delegates, the participants who have joined us virtually from South Africa, across the continent, from even beyond. Thank you so much for the rich discussion, the really insightful questions that we've had. There's been so much chatter in the virtual chat box. I've been following some of it, but I almost have a little bit of what's that, FOMO, fear of missing out, because I've been wanting to follow the chat online, but also listen to the presentation. So it's really been a rich environment for discussion, and I hope that we can continue this dialogue. And it's so exciting that the World Circular Economy Forum is in just 2 weeks' time. So I think that a lot of these points we'll be picking up again, either at the World Circular Economy Forum in Rwanda, or certainly in the studio, the Cape Town studio that that ACEN will be driving as well. So from my side, a very big thank you to everybody. I hope that you've all benefited from the 2 mornings, and let's see how we continue to drive this discussion forward. Thank you.